Welcome to the People of AI podcast, showcasing inspiring people with interesting stories in the field of artificial intelligence. I'm Ashley Oldacre. Let's jump right in. This podcast is sponsored by Google. Any remarks made by the speakers are their own and are not endorsed by Google. Hi everybody, Ashley here. We are very, very excited today to be welcoming Ovetta Sampson. And like with all of our guests, we'll start by reading your bio. Ovetta Sampson is a design executive who has led and developed several multidisciplinary teams at global companies such as IDEO, Microsoft, and Capital One. She's currently the Director of User Experience for AI, Compute Enablement at Google. An expert in ML, AI infrastructure, and product design, Ovetta's sweet spot is taking the deep expertise of engineering, product management, and design and creating transdisciplinary practices, policies, and teams that produce better, more human-centered products, platforms, and services. Welcome, Ovetta.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I feel honored and humbled.
Well, so do I to have you here and to have you spend your time to tell us about all of the incredible things that you're working on. And we'd love to actually start with your origin story.
Well, I won't make this Ovetta the biography, but I will start when I was 9 years old, because I think that was a seminal year for me. And that was the first year that I ever wrote my first computer program. My dad was going to night school and he was studying Cobalt and Fortran. And my dad also worked full time. And so I didn't have a lot of time with my dad, but he would go downstairs in our basement and he would work on his homework from his night classes at Chicago State University. And so I would go down there to try to help him at 9. And he noticed that I was really interested in the computer programming that he was doing. And I wanted to learn Cobalt and Fortran. I don't recommend that for 9-year-olds, but he knew that I wanted to spend more time with him. So he bought me a Commodore 64 and I started to learn programming. I did a Hello World. And so that kind of started my fascination with technology. I thought it was magic that you could do a couple of syntax like symbols and this machine would start talking to you. And, you know, as a 9-year-old, that was pretty magical. At the same time, I was writing a lot for my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Smith. Shout out to Mrs. Smith. And she made us write stories in school and then made us read them in front of the class. And some of us acted them out. It was really hilarious. I still remember those. But I also had my first story published. So those two events were kind of seminal in my life. And I didn't pursue computer programming because when I went to elementary school, we didn't have a computer program at my school, and neither at my high school.
Kind of exposure.
No,
yeah.
And so my 4th grade teacher said, "Hey, you're a good writer, so you should probably pursue that." And so by the time I got to high school, I started working as a journalist. I was a reporter, but I also designed the paper, and so that's how I got my first Mac. The little one with the disc that you put inside that looked like a little munchkin. That was my first kind of like exposure to amazing GUI and design for technology. And so,
were you coding sort of on the side as well?
Yeah, I was, because when you're designing back then, for millennials and anybody younger, they used to have these things called newspapers where they would deliver yesterday's news today, right, on your doorstep in a paper. So those were the things that I was designing. So it was like 6 columns, and you had to use these designing programs to fit all of the content onto the pages. And we were designing with like Quark and Unisys, and I've had more design programs. Now everything is Figma now, but at that time it was pretty archaic. And so it was part programming and part creativity, because you had to like figure out how much room you had for how much context and words. And then you had to kind of like program it so that it could fit across on on the page in the correct way. So my brain was kind of like switching in and out of like writing and then like programming so that the writing, and designing. So when I got to designing websites, it was really actually pretty easy.
That's up your alley.
Yeah, because like I could look at a web page and I could see the programming in my brain. Like, that is a bold headline, and I know what I need to do, the syntax I need to do to make that red instead of blue and stuff like that.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Okay, so sounds like you had like almost a full-on career up until like high school.
Right. It was weird. Like in high school, I was the editorial editor of my newspaper, and shout out to Wendy, who was the editor of the newspaper. And so I was like writing, interviewing, doing synthesis on all those interviews, pulling out the salient points, writing that up as an article, and then like designing all the pages so that the article could be read by, the 100 people or so who were actually reading our newspaper. Yeah. And then as a freshman in college, I was like one of the few freshmen on the Index at Northeast Missouri State University, also known as Truman State. And the Index had a real, it was a small newspaper in Missouri, but it had a good reputation as a good journalism program. And so that's why I went to it and started working on the paper as a reporter. And then Rob Schneider, who we're still friends today, shout out Rob, asked me to be the sports editor. And so I started really kind of like designing large special sections and things like that. I worked on the yearbook, all those kinds of things, and was also working in radio and television. And so I was really kind of understanding both the creative part of media, but also the tech.
Wow, hand in hand all the way through.
Yeah. So I was reporting and writing, but I was also editing and designing. I was shooting video and filming and putting together radio shows. I was a DJ at night. Urban Sensations.
I love it. Oh my God, that's awesome. Wait, what was
at Kirksville? It was called Urban Sensations, right? In Kirksville, Missouri.
Great.
And so this idea of the English language and creativity with technology was always kind of like in my brain. It was like my brain was hardwired to translate creativity into tools so that people could experience them in different ways.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
Right? Also, like getting into the tech and then, coding so that the creativity then is represented on the back, on the front end too.
Yeah. Anybody who's ever developed a website understands CSS, and not my favorite language, but it was definitely like that was the language you used to make the creativity show on the web. Mm-hmm. It was the language that you had to use to make people see all the colors that you were thinking about, the placement, and how things were arranged in a creative way. And so you had to talk to a computer to get the computer to do what you wanted it to do so that it can show what you wanted it to show. And so I guess, God, this is the first time I'm really realizing that. I guess like when I first started in designing newspapers, that's what I was really aiming for, to understand computers so that I can speak to them in a way that they could do so that they can show the things that I wanted people to see.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's been a theme that started young, but has also progressed all the way into what you're doing now. So you left us at college where you were running a sports section of the local newspaper.
I was sports editor of the college newspaper, which really was,
the local.
It had the Kirksville. Hey, I'm not, they had a paper too as well for the city, but the college took up so much time and effort. Yeah. And, being a sports editor was really fun and I really enjoyed it. But it was also like I won't say that other places didn't have deadlines, but like we published on a Thursday and all of the basketball games were on Wednesday nights. So we had to like cover the games, write about the games, shoot the game, and then design the pages for the game, and then send the paper to publication. So I learned a lot about deadlines. Yeah. and then of course I got my first real job at 19, and then I learned about daily deadlines where you had to write like 4 to 5 stories and get them into the paper.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Okay, so that was after college?
Yeah, so I graduated and got a job at St. Joseph News Press. Shout out. And this was, God, my life is so weird. So St. Joseph News Press was a privately owned newspaper in Northwest Missouri, right? And it was like the go-between anywhere else in America and Kansas City, right? Because it was right along the Pony Express. Like Jesse James has a museum there, everything. So it was kind of like this vortex of like future things. It was weird. And it was owned by this family of the Butlers, 2 brothers. They owned it. And they also owned the cable company. And so in 1994, they found out about this thing called the internet. And they wanted to transfer the newspaper onto the internet. And so that's when I actually started really coding, transferring what we were writing in the newspaper to a web page in 1994. I'm dating myself for a lot of reasons, but now it made me realize why I still had that connection between tech and creativity, because that was a rare opportunity to, 1994, not many people had websites. And so that was a rare opportunity to work on the web and to learn on the job how to translate stories and narratives, photos and creativity to this newfangled thing called the web.
Wow. Okay. So then that's sort of when it really takes off, where again, this idea of more and more taking the creativity, the things that you're wanting to sort of visualize and picture in 3D, sort of putting it into the computer and having it reflected there.
Yeah, on web pages. And, that was back when we had like Prodigy and AOL, and like most people didn't have an email address. They didn't, like, everybody has a web page now, even my grandmother. Back then nobody had it. And so it was like a seminal time for the web. And we were like actually scanning stories until we realized that you could actually recreate them in the syntax of HTML.
Well, speaking of being sort of at a seminal point in tech, we're at a seminal point with AI right now. And I'd love for you to tell us a bit about how you got into AI and sort of bringing, because again, the theme is I think, really getting the computer to being sort of a translator to the computer, learning how to talk to the computer so that it is able to generate what we want to be able to see on a screen. And so,
yeah, I'm definitely a person who learns what she needs to learn to get what I want.
Yeah.
And I had to learn HTML and CSS to get the pages to look the way I wanted.
Yeah.
And I ended up learning algorithms and statistics, because when I left St. Joe, which was my first job out of school, and I went to Colorado Springs, I started doing this thing called computer assisted reporting. I was a crime reporter for about 8 years and an education reporter. And so I worked on long investigative stories that required a lot of number crunching. And so when you're number crunching, you're going through large vats of data. And so I had to learn a couple of programming languages. I had to learn SQL, and I had to learn R so that I could make sense of a lot of that data, right? And once you and Python, of course. And so this is like I was a journalist for about 10 years at this point, and I was doing really long investigative stories that required a lot of data. And so I had to kind of understand how data is collected, how it's engineered, how to make sense of it, reading large large amounts of data. How do I make sense out of it and interpret it?
Yeah.
And when I went to grad school at 38, or almost 40, I took a couple of classes called predictive analytics. I took an algorithm class, and I took a high-level statistics class in grad school. And that's kind of how I fell into AI. Now, at the point, I didn't understand that these were all precursor to developing models, but I was literally developing models so that I could understand some of the data that I was being tasked with to interpret and write stories about. And so when I went to grad school and took classes like predictive analytics and realized that I was the only designer in the room, everybody else was like a statistician or a physics major or a data scientist. I thought, hey, what's going on here? And then I discovered machine learning.
Okay.
And once I graduated from DePaul with my Master's of Science in Computer Science with an emphasis in human-computer interaction, I got hired by IDEO in Chicago. And this was in 2016. And at that time, they were working with this data science corporation called Datascope. And they were trying to basically figure out how do you do human-centered AI design. And so I was the first design researcher that was embedded with Datascope, and I worked on 4 to 5 projects with them trying to figure out how do you mix human-centered design with machine learning and AI systems design. And at the time, I had no idea that that was actually very rare, that a designer was helping to shape models. Mm-hmm. Or even knew what a model, how to create a model.
Can you give us an example of some of the projects you worked on that sort of illustrate sort of how you're combining all of these sort of interdisciplinary?
Yeah. So I guess this isn't a trade secret. So no, this isn't, because we wrote about it. So one of the projects that we wrote about one of the projects that I worked on as a lead design researcher was for a medical malpractice company. It was a huge company that basically was the lawyers for doctors. So the clients were both lawyers and doctors. Like the board of directors were doctors and lawyers, and then like you had like the chief counsel guy. And so now their intent was really great. They were a company that wanted to prevent malpractice lawsuits. They wanted to upskill their doctors into the latest, greatest, and they wanted to help their doctors to learn from the mistakes of prior doctors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they had a series of courses that doctors could take to kind of like it was like, hey, this is a new complication in pregnancy. Take this course and learn all about it so that the next time, you're with a patient, you can recognize this. And other things like wash your hands, which, of course, we all know, but isn't really done a lot in clinics and stuff like that. Yeah. And so they had like these series of courses that were basically risk preventative because they didn't want their doctors to end up being sued for malpractice. And I remember working with the data scientists because I was like, hey, this sounds really good, but what are the consequences? Like, we could hurt a lot of people if these doctors like use this in the wrong way or something like that. Right. So that was kind of the element that we brought into the numbers crunching and predictive analytics, where we were like, the human-centered part was like, yeah, we could create a predictive a search engine that could predict whether you were on the road to committing fraud or malpractice or whatever. Yeah. But then what would that do to the doctor if that ever got out?
Right.
Let's say the
Right.
doctor got a C score, right,
Right.
on all the things, just because he didn't know that these were new things or whatever, whatever it was.
Right.
Like, what would what would happen to that doctor if anybody ever saw that predictive score, right?
Right.
And so these were kind of the questions as a design researcher, and the data scientists that I worked with. They were amazing because they were human-centered as well, that we would talk about before we designed the model. One of the things as a design researcher too, I was mapping the journey of a malpractice suit. And I was trying to figure out how we can talk the machine to get what we want. I was trying to figure out how you could predict if something was going to actually be a malpractice win. So you think about it, you have like 500 cases over 20 years. And like in that case, how do you know that this one actually is a malpractice, right? And I met this woman who worked at the company, and her job was intake. So she would be the first person that any doctor would talk to if they felt that they had a problem that might,
increase or lead them on the path.
Lead them on the path to malpractice. So she did all the intake forms, and I called her the human algorithm because when I talked to her, I watched her do her job, and she would put some intake forms on the right, and then everything else would stay in the pile. And I asked her, like, why would you put that over there? She was like, oh, that's going to be a malpractice.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, how do you know? And she's like, oh, I've been doing this 20 years. And let me tell you. And so she had these indicators of, like, it was bizarre. Like, she had these things that I would never put together, but that she put together to say, if this happens, if this happens, if this happens, then this is the one that I warn my boss about.
Right.
So I wrote about that and synthesized our conversation, and that was kind of how they built the model. And it was like her and another young lady who was like a secretary, but she was a secretary they had like closed door board meetings to review the cases. And she was a secretary in all of those meetings, and she had the same system. Like, she would say, oh, this is going to trial, or this is not going to trial. And nobody ever talked to those two ladies.
Right.
And I was like, these ladies are like gold.
Yeah.
Because they were synthesizing all this information as humans. And so they were kind of like the foundation that they were building, with the model in mind. And so when you think about human-centered design, human-centered AI design, it's not about the artificial intelligence, which is neither artificial or intelligent, by the way. We can talk about that later. It's really about how do you augment the superpower of human beings.
Oh, I love that. Well, and actually that was one of the questions I was going to ask is I loved what you said just now about like it's about augmenting, AI is about augmenting the superpowers of humans.
Right.
So say more about how you come to that conclusion and how you apply that in the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, the second part is hard. But the first part is where I live most of my life. And a lot of AI today is tech-driven. It's not human-centered at all. It's
so what does that mean?
It's driven by the capability of the technology rather than solving a human problem.
So it's more like, what can the tech do?
Yeah.
And like,
so how do
cool.
we fit a use case to it? So the
Right.
tech can do this. So how do we fit a use case to what the tech is capable of? Human-centered AI, to me, the way that I was practicing it was, what is it that human beings really could use help with that help augments a solution that they have, a problem that they have. It augments a solution that only technology can scale and do. For example, a friend of mine who I worked with at Microsoft. His name is Benjamin K. Shout out. He's French and he loves to bake bread. And during COVID, he was trying to get... So if you've ever baked bread or watched the Great British
Baking show,
then you know about proving, right? Because that is like the big deal, right? That's where everything goes wrong.
Right.
If you don't prove, you don't prove it right, then, your bread doesn't come out right. And basically proving, what happens is the yeast basically eats up all the other gases and then the bread expands, right? And all of those gases have like a numerical like imprint, right? Like H2O and CO2 and all that. So if you pair a sensor, a gas sensor, with a small, tiny AI predictive model, machine learning model, and you put those together, then the model can predict when bread is proofed just right. Because it'll use all of those gases, which has a numerical match to it, and tell you the time when the right amount of CO2 has been eaten by the yeast and is no longer in the air, right? And so that's a way to create an AI nose, right? That's how AI smells, right? So AI can say, hey, because all these gases give off, obviously, a smell, which is what people use, right, their nose to kind of see what the proofing is. But AI will kind of like refine that to an accuracy of 0.1% because it's actually reading the actual amount of gases that is being produced by this process. Now, that is not a human-centered design thing. It could be for Benjamin because it worked out his proofing thing. But a 13-year-old in California saw Benjamin's process in this Maker magazine and took that process and decided to do the same thing with pneumonia.
Oh, wow.
So he created, in a lab, a nose that could detect the beginning of the gases that build up in our respiratory system to detect whether pneumonia we were getting sick. Somebody could get sick from pneumonia. Now, that's a human-centered kind of design, right? Because like you could use that in a refugee camp, right, to prevent the spread of pneumonia or something like that.
Or
a hospital or schools or things like that. And so it's matching the capability with a human-centered problem, right?
Well, isn't there, I think that's what's interesting is that I think there's no doubt that human-centered AI and human-centered problems are sort of the ideal. But when you are building a new technology, like if Benjamin hadn't been playing around with this technology and doing something, that benefited his use case, but as you said, wasn't entirely human-centered, but it was just kind of playing around with it. Is there value in sort of technology for technology's sake of just seeing where things go and people playing with it? Or is it really, is sort of the better approach to look at things more from a problem use case of, what can you solve? Or are those things sort of go hand in hand? Like what's your opinion on that?
Well, I'm not going to say there's not value in technology for technology's sake. I would say there's not value for humanity sometimes, right? Like, because, dynamite was technology for technology's sake too. And look where it got us kind of, and I think we have to be careful. I think if we don't have a human-centered, it doesn't have to be our motivation, but it definitely should be in the orbit. Then we get things like nuclear bombs.
Yeah.
Right. Because enough people, and again, like I like to mirror, or I like to look at the AI arms race in parallel as biomedical ethics. So if you think about the 1960s and the 1950s, people were talking about stem cells and embryos and, think about the time before in vitro fertilization was a thing. Think how, if you can, like I can, because I was born I was born right before the first in vitro fertilization baby came out, right? But if you think about that couple in England, in Sussex, right? They really just wanted to have a baby. And their doctor teamed up with a technologist, and the first quote unquote test tube baby was born, right? Do you think that they were like thinking about technology at that time or thinking about technology for technology's sake? Nope. They were like, we want to be parents and we can't be parents naturally. How can we be parents? They were desperate to have a child, right? In England. And a technologist and a doctor got together, and now we have IVF. But then we also have the stem cell debate and embryonic stem cells and cloning. And, you know, it's kind of like, I love to swim, right? I love swimming, but I hate sand. Right? So you're like, you go to the beach and you're like, oh God, I gotta get through all of this sand to get to the water, right? It's the same with technology, right? It's like, there are amazing, great things that happen with it. But to get to those amazing, great things is a lot of sand.
Yeah.
Right? And so if we want to be human-centered about it, we just have to acknowledge the sand. Mm-hmm. And design for it. As a designer, that's why I say, and design for it, right?
Right.
So I'm not saying that technology for technology's sake is a bad thing. What I'm saying is it's a bad thing to think that technology is agnostic.
Say more.
Meaning it's a dangerous thing to think that technology, once created, will not have a social cultural effect on society.
I see. Yeah. Yeah.
And there are some people who think like that, right? And I'm not talking about the doom and gloomers who are like Skynet, whatever. I'm talking about the little things that we have ignored in AI, and people have constantly, repeatedly pointed to that people kind of like poo-pooed and did not really pay attention to, and now it's biting us because of the scale. And what I'm talking about is like using traumatized data sets, right? Mm-hmm. If you're doing predictive analytics on, like in Chicago, they had something called the strategic subjects list. And it was a model that was written by a nice little professor at the University of Chicago that was designed to predict people who were going to be the victim or perpetrator of crimes in the South Side of Chicago. A real minority, Minority Report. And intent, great. Mm-hmm. But one of those people on the list, Robert Johnson, police showed up to his door. He got on the list. They finally sued, the journalists finally sued to get the training and data sets that this algorithm was trained on. And one of those data sets were police arrest records. Mm. Well, I don't know about you, but I've been a crime reporter for 8 years, and I know that everybody arrested is not a criminal. Right. Just because they get arrested doesn't mean that they're a criminal. And even people who get convicted can be wrongly convicted, right?
Right.
So that's a traumatized data set, if you ask me. If you're using that to train a model to predict who's going to be a criminal.
And you're not taking into consideration all of the other factors as well, like race, like background, like all of these things that bias the data set. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, I was a reporter and a crime reporter for 8 years, and I've still never realized why we use race as a way to identify suspects, because research has shown that identifying a suspect by race is the most faulty thing that we can do. Identifying a suspect by what he has on, perfect. Mm-hmm. Tracksuit, red, hat, but race, a lot of people can't tell the difference between a Hispanic person and a non-Hispanic person, a Latin person and a black person sometimes. So it still boggles my mind that we use race as a way to identify suspects in newspapers as well as in court. But that's an aside. So police were using this algorithm that we know was using traumatized data sets to get its outcome. And police ended up at Robert Johnson's door, who had never committed a crime before. And basically they were like, we're watching you. And then there was this like social worker there going, hopefully you're not a victim of crime, you know. And then, you know, he became a victim of crime, right? And he blames the algorithm because he said that when police came to his door, his neighbors thought of him as a snitch. So whatever. So again, like, is he right? I don't know. But at the end of the day, these are real consequences for these models. And one of my passions project is researching how AI intersects with our cognitive biases to produce really bad outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so when I say that there's nothing wrong with technology for technology's sake, I only say that it's wrong if you believe that technology is not going to affect humanity in some way.
Yeah, I mean, that's also one of the questions we ask too, is like, especially with responsible AI, is when do you put on that responsibility thinking? Is it like when you're solving the problem? Is it beforehand? And it sounds like there has to be this really hand-in-hand system where people who are developing the technology are also either thinking or partnering with someone who is thinking about sort of the implications of this? Or is this something you can even predict ahead of time? Because like the thing that I'm seeing is that there's this bigger push and pull. There's such a pull between building something cool and new and pushing the technology to see what it can do, trying to match it with something that's useful, trying to understand and make sure that with something so new that has never been developed before, how we anticipate and make sure that it isn't harmful with a business need to get things out the door.
Yeah, and I think that's a paradigm that you are putting very nicely in all of the different audience or all of the different ideas that are competing for our attention when we're making these products. But I'm going to challenge you on a couple of things. We've been here before. So AI may be new, but technology that affects humanity is not.
Right.
Humanity is not new.
Right.
Humanity changes a lot slower than technology advances. Mm-hmm. So human decision making over the last century could tell me, doesn't matter the technology, poor people, marginalized groups, people who don't have power will be affected negatively by it.
Right.
Rich people, high percentage net worth people who do have power won't be affected negatively by it because they will control it. I can tell you that without no.
Right.
I can tell you that in 20 years, don't even know the technology.
Right. Right.
And so there are definite things that we know that society follows in patterns if we know our history. Mm-hmm. Now, if we know and acknowledge our history, some people know it and don't acknowledge it. I get it. But if we know and acknowledge our history, we know that technology has been used, science has been used to do some pretty awful things to people around the world. Something in the 1930s and 40s, right? Something in the 1950s, something in the 1960s, right? Like we can go on and on. So we know this about ourselves. We know this about our society. Why would we develop technology in a vacuum outside of morality and ethics? We do. I took ethics in high school. I don't know how many developers take ethics. Pretty easy fix. I'm not like pitching anything radical. Pretty easy fix. Yet we don't have ethics in our computer programming schools. Why? Mm-hmm. Why? And I'm not saying we should teach a particular ethics, but just you take ethics to learn how to critically think about your own biases. That's what ethics helps you to do, right? So that you can critically decide whether your decision is good or bad, on an individual basis as well as a community. So it's about way of thinking. It's not the outcome, right? So if we know that technology has a way to go left really quickly, right? Why wouldn't we want our technologists to learn how to think critically about their own biases? Pretty easy fix. Okay, moving on. So I get it. I get that people are saying that there's this tug of war between business models, responsible AI, product design, capabilities of AI. But I'm saying there should not be a tension between business model, capability of AI, product design, and the push to create AI-powered products. The only reason why there's a tension is because people are not equitably looking at all of those as equal missions to complete, right? So if you say, hey, my bottom line is to make money, then you're going to sacrifice all other kinds of things. And that could be responsible AI, that could be labor, that could be considered what can happen wrongly, blah, blah, blah. But I say if you look at each one of those tensions as equal in the pie, then you come out with a company that is responsible as a business model.
And a product as a result.
Right. And a product as a result.
Yeah.
Right. And does that company anticipate all the things that can go wrong with AI? Nope. But that company acknowledges that AI can go wrong. Mm-hmm. And develops the avenues and pathways for the people who use its products to help them and alert them when it does go wrong. That to me is human-centered AI. It's saying AI is neither artificial intelligence, which means I have the power to create it to this day. Now, 20 years from now, maybe not. But right now, we still have the power to shape it and create it. And it's saying I have the power to shape it and create it, and I want to shape it and create it so that the people who use my products are not harmed by it. And that is my business model.
So my interpretation of democratizing AI is accessibility, right? Opening it up so that it's being used, it's being looked at by many versus just few, that it's also in the hands of many versus few, and also at the same time that it is human-centered. And so I'd love for you to talk about that with that mission, how you include that in your work today and the projects you're working on.
Yeah, so my team works deep in the stack. We work in ML infrastructure. So what most people really think about when they think about AI is they think about that superpowered assistant who knows that you drink coffee at 9 o'clock and, alerts you to 8:55 to kind of like get the
Place
water
your
ready.
Order. Yeah.
And that's cool. And what my team does is we help to build all the tools and platforms that developers use to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And so our user group is pretty focused. And so our job is to make their job easier. Mm-hmm. And one of those ways that we're trying to make their job easier is by shifting the burden of responsible AI from the individual developer to the system. So the system really understanding, what needs to happen in responsible AI and assisting the developer to make sure that that's happening. So if you're using a data set that may have problems, right, then the system would alert you to, hey, this data set is not clean, or it's biased, or it's over-indexed on females, or things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's one way. Helping to build a system that understands the indicators of responsible AI and shifting that burden from the individual to the system to help. Obviously, you still have humans in the loop because humans need to be there, but the more that we can help build these types of responsible responsible activities into the system, the easier, first of all, the better it is to scale, the better it is for consistency. Like you can't go your own rogue way, right? And the better it is for the company.
Right.
Why? Because I worked in banking. So in banking, every model you make is audited by a third-party regulator from the government, right? Why? Why does it happen in banking, right? Right. It happens in banking because of racial, gender, and discrimination biases in money lending. So anything that a bank does is subject to regulation by the federal government. So banks have been making models for like 25 years, right? Like FICO scores are models, right? It's a predictive model.
Right.
Built in 1958 by some accountant, right? That we still use today. Which is weird since women weren't included in those and neither were Black women. But hey, traumatized data set. Anyway, so see how insidious this is? It's incestuous. It's throughout all our systems. But anyway, so because of things like that, right? You have the federal government to audit models from banks to make sure that they're not being discriminatory. Now, do banks want to be discriminatory? No, money is green. Doesn't really matter where it comes from, right? But because they use traumatized data sets and other things like that, and other kinds of social cultural norms that aren't, related to money, but are related to how society operates, there will be bias in some of their model outcomes, right? And so you have federal government auditors who are looking at these models to make sure that they aren't over-indexed or biased. And you should be auditing your models.
Right. And so that's what you're working on at Google
yes.
to develop. Is that is an example of a system, a tool, an infrastructure? I don't know.
Yeah, you have to have all three. Like you have to have an infrastructure that allows you to do that. You have to have tooling to help you to do that so that the humans can read what the machine is throwing out, right?
Right.
So we can we can put it on a dashboard and we can see.
Yeah. Trace, as you said, sort of the outcomes to the data set and really sort of go through what the data set is doing and outputting.
Yeah. It's kind of like I think in medicine, like you could swallow something and it shows in an X-ray or something where basically that's what we're talking about, where you can just like see like a beeline between this is a model outcome. Where does this come from? Now these models are I call them models, but that's a wrong way to. If you should visualize a deep neural network, you should visualize webs and webs and webs connected together, making an outcome. So it's not like it's A to B.
Right. You have to sort of retrace.
Yeah, it's very it's like a figure eight, right?
Right. So all of the
because sometimes a lot of that data doesn't even get into the model, right? Because it's weighted differently.
Right.
So it's not an easy thing to do with a deep neural network. Certainly not.
No.
With a model that I can make, yes. Very easy. Like I make rule models, right? If then that, right?
Yes.
Very easy, right?
Yeah.
But the models, like a company like Google or
large language models,
are almost impossible.
Yeah. I think based off of the conversation we've just had, this is such an appropriate direction to go into because typically the way that I've understood it and we've sort of explained it on the podcast is being a person of AI historically was just reserved to people that were building the models, that was building the technology. So researchers, I would say, And then it evolved into developers, so folks that started building on top of the technology. And now anybody that's using it, I mean, it's in our phones, it's in our Google, it's in our photos, it's everywhere now. And so does that mean that everyone's a person of AI? And so we've been asking this question of like, what does it mean now to be a person of AI? In a previous episode, we talked about what does it mean to be a responsible person of AI? And I think I'd like to extend the question to you of what does it mean to be a person of AI, but also I think, what does it mean to be a person of AI that is also integrating somehow or folding into human-centeredness? Maybe the better question is, what does it mean to be a human-centered person of AI? I don't know if you want to maybe we define the first one and talk about the second one, or.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna answer this by giving you an example. So there was a athletic coach at a high school, and he used an AI program to clone his principal's voice and create a recording of a racist telephone call. All right. So he sent this recording to the board, and the board was like, what? This principal was saying all this racist stuff. Like, it was an uproar, and parents, and then they found out that this coach had did it because he didn't get promoted. I give you that example about what does it mean to be a human-centered person of AI. That's not it, yo. But that's human. So prior to AI, that coach could have wrote a letter, right? That he forged the coach's or the principal's signature and sent it to the board, right? May not have been believable, right? But cloning his voice and making it this racist tirade and then sending that to the board is a distinctly human thing to do, even though it's horrible. But the technology that he used makes it so much more weaponized. And that, to me, is the world we're living in. So you break up with somebody and they don't take it well, right? They could throw a drink in your face and move on 5 years ago. Today, they can make whole swaths of revenge animated movies about you with your face and your body and your voice. Like, that's what I'm more scared of. I'm less scared of like corporations, like, because, lawyers and senators are going to keep those in check. I'm more scared of what humans are going to do to humans with this technology. And so what, to me, it means to be a human-centered AI person is the same thing it meant in kindergarten. Keep your hands to yourself. Be kind. Be nice. Use this technology for the benefit of others and not just yourself. Right? Don't do anything to anyone that you would not like them to do to you. Like, those are things that we should be teaching people when they use this technology.
So being a person of AI, I mean, I like what you said about people are always going to be people, for better or for worse. And so being a responsible person of AI, I think the dream or the goal is to really be somebody that is going to use the technology. Being a person of AI is a person who's going to use AI for the benefit, for good.
Right. I mean, you have the coach and you have the 13-year-old in California. They both are using AI technology, but for much different purposes.
Right. The kid who
used it for pneumonia detection.
Yeah.
Right. So again, like, it's good and bad people. Like, again, AI is neither artificial or intelligent. And what I mean by that is man has the power to shape it, man and women. Humanity has the power still to shape it. And the intelligence is the input that we give it, right? So Gemini could be a totally different model if we put it in prisons and that's where it learned. Or if we put it in kindergarten and that's where it learned.
I don't know which one would be worse.
Right? I mean, toddlers are just really, they haven't gotten to their moral code yet, right? So I'm just saying, like wherever we put it, right, and it learns, right, it adapts, and that's its foundation, and then it goes on and it thinks on its own, but it always has that foundation, right? And so So I always say in my talks, I said, you wouldn't sit your toddler and plug it into the internet and then let that toddler go roaming around the world. Like, that's an irresponsible parent.
Right.
Right. Same with AI. Like, we have trained large language models on the internet, and that in itself is problematic, right? Because the internet isn't all great. So this is what I tell teams. I said, we have to shape it, teach it what's good and bad, and shape it to get good outcomes. Same with people. So we have to teach them how to use it and not weaponize it. So when I was younger, I was a journalist for 22 years, and I used to teach media literacy classes to teenagers. So helping them to discern fake news from real news. How do they determine whether a news story has credibility or not? What to look for, things like that. We need to do that with AI literacy too. Like, how do we tell if something is fake or not? Like, that coach, that principal, I would hate to be him, right? Because you didn't do it,
right?
And yet it's your voice,
right?
Right? How do you defend against that?
Right.
And so I think we have focused on the capabilities of AI a lot, and I want us to focus on its limitations and design for that.
Yeah.
That's what I want us to do. And that's the area that I want to do more research in and focus on and help teams, especially design teams, to bring that up. Because if it's not a design team, I don't know who is going to do it. Because our job as human-centered designers, and human-centered design is a profession, not a framework.
Yes.
It has an ISO definition. And your job as a human-centered designer is, yes, to get requirements from users and stuff like that. But the second half of that definition is to make sure that you're not designing things that cognitively, physically, or psychologically harm people.
Right.
And so it's our job, really, as human-centered designers, to make sure that AI doesn't do those things.
Right. What a wonderful way to end. Ovetta, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and to share these really valuable insights and your journey and your experience. And it's a real privilege to have you in the industry.
I appreciate you. Thank you for having me on. This was wonderful. And I hope I didn't say anything too controversial, but if I did, it's okay. I'm used to it.
If you would like to learn more about our conversation or our guests, check out the links below. Please subscribe, and if you're feeling extra generous, give us a 5-star rating. We would love to hear from you, so leave us a comment. We'll read every one. Until next time, thank you for listening.